Thank you. Thanks for the conversation on this. This is important because we're dealing with the financial future of the country. Two big issues here. Congress has got to be able to work on getting our debt down. First, our deficit down, our debt down. All these things are patchworked with the Federal Reserve trying to be able to figure out how to be able to manage economy with the amount of debt that we're currently carrying as a nation. Second thing on this, though, is this is an entirely new system that's out there. We're talking the last 15 years, the rules have changed and everything. The amount of quantitative easing, what's actually happening with the interest on reserve balances. This is an experiment. We really don't know where this goes 50 years from now, 35 years from now, and some of the acceleration. And so it's entirely reasonable for us to be able to have this dialogue, to be able to talk it through and to be able to deal with. Let me try to deal with a couple of things on this. One is the amount that's interest on reserve balances given to foreign banks. Obviously, that is in direct competition with our domestic banks, obviously, but it's also what would have been American tax dollars going back into the Treasury, actually going to a foreign bank to be able to stabilize their reserve balance as well. What effect does that have on our American economy for that much money? Does anyone know the amount of interest on reserve balances Federal Reserve has paid to foreign banks?
I think this was in the study that that Dr. Paul released, and it is substantial.
Substantial.
And because the foreign banks do hold lots of deposits at the Federal Reserve. It serves a purpose for U.S. and foreign citizens. The foreign banks help to facilitate transactions between countries. They help U.S. exporters, for example.
But if we go back 15 years ago, it was bank to bank that were actually dealing with this rather than the Federal Reserve being able to hold it over.
Right.
And my bigger question on this is really what, if we were to, let's say, slowly taper this away. There's been some arguments to say 6 months is too fast. Dr. Paul is always in a hurry to solve every problem. So they've said, you know what, his bill is just too fast to be able to implement on this. We need more time than that. When I ask the question of banks and to say, how much time do you need? It's always as much time as we can get. But then my second question to them is, what would you do instead? And every one of them I've talked to said the same thing. We would buy treasuries. I was like, why is that a bad thing for our economy, for banks to be able to buy into treasuries? We're selling treasuries already at record numbers out there. We need consistent buyers on this. Why is this a bad thing for us to switch from interest on reserve balances to actually banks actually buying treasuries?
It's not a bad thing. And if they want to buy treasuries, they can buy treasuries, and that's fine. And if I want to buy treasuries, I can buy treasuries, but I can't take the proceeds from my sale of treasuries and park them at the Fed and earn exactly what I was earning when I had the treasuries. That's why it's a windfall.
Right. Anyone else make a comment on that?
Well, you're talking about whether the Fed should be buying the treasuries or the banks.
The banks.
Right.
The banks.
So the same number of treasuries need to be sold to fund the deficit that you and Senator Johnson were talking about. So that, and the question is whether it's the Fed or the banks. And certainly, before 2008, the banks found ways of making these transactions. It was perhaps a bit more cumbersome than it is today with the interest on reserves. So yes, they'll find a way of doing the same things, but you will handicap the Federal Reserve. Remember, Congress actually authorized this in 2006. I testified in 2004 in favor of paying interest on reserves, so I'm a little consistent over time. And my point then was not paying interest on reserve balances was a tax on the banks. The banks naturally were trying to avoid the tax, as we all do. They avoided the tax by keeping deposits lower, by discouraging certain kinds of deposits where they have to hold reserves, and by passing on that cost to borrowers and lenders. So I think the Congress recognized the inefficiencies of not paying interest on reserves and authorized the Fed to do it with no expectation that a 2008 would come about.
Right. Yeah, the challenge is, just for basic safety and soundness of a bank, there is a good reason to be able to keep significant reserves in a bank. But to be able to say that just because we require you to be safe and sound, that's a tax on the bank, that's a part I guess I don't agree with. That's just
well, when we weren't paying in, so we said to the banks, you have to keep deposits at the Federal Reserve paying zero. You have to make an interest-free loan to the government. That's a tax.
Right. Well, Mr. Westbury, you're about to say something as well.
Yeah. From the beginning of the Fed all the way through 2008, we did not have banking problems because banks had too few reserves. That's not why we had banking problems. The great financial crisis did not come about because banks had too few reserves. That's not what was the problem. And so, and the second point I would make is that quantitative easing didn't save the economy either. We passed quantitative easing in September of 2008, and the market fell another 40% after that in the next 9 months. And it wasn't until March of '09 that everything turned around. And the one thing that changed then was we altered this mark-to-market accounting rule. That was the real problem with the banking system. And what the Fed did is they took advantage of that crisis and grew their balance sheet massively. From $850 billion to today over almost $7 trillion. And then the second point I would make is, yes, the bank should own the Treasury bonds. Instead, what's happened is that the Fed buys them. And the Fed now, on the Fed's books, there are $800 billion of losses from the Treasury bonds it bought during 2008 and then again during COVID. And so what they really did is they took the risk out of the free market and put it on the Fed's balance sheet. And because the Fed doesn't care about losses, they don't mark them to market. They can print money to take care of the losses. And so what this has done is distorted the economy and allowed us to spend more as a nation than we would if we had to pay the real price of that borrowing.